Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. While her classmates spent their weekends at shopping malls and movie theaters, she could be found deep in the Montana wilderness with her father, learning the ancient art of hunting. At 22, she possessed skills that would make seasoned hunters envious. Her hands were steady, her aim was true, and her instincts were sharp as the mountain air she breathed. Growing up on a ranch 40 miles outside of Billings, Sarah learned early that survival meant more than just knowing how to shoot. Her father, Miguel Martinez, was a third-generation rancher who believed his daughter needed to understand every aspect of life on the frontier. From the age of 8, Sarah could track deer through thick underbrush, read weather patterns and cloud formations, and, most importantly, handle firearms with the respect and precision they demanded. The rifle that would soon change her life was a family heirloom. Her great-grandfather had carried the Winchester Model 70 during his service in World War II, and it had been passed down through 3 generations. The wooden stock bore the scratches and were marks of decades of use, each nick telling a story of survival and perseverance. Miguel had given it to Sarah on her 18th birthday, along with a solemn promise that she would honor the legacy it represented. Sarah's expertise with the rifle was legendary in their small community. She had won the state championship in precision shooting 3 years running, and local law enforcement often called upon her to help with wildlife control issues. When a pack of coyotes threatened livestock in the valley, Sarah was the one ranchers called. When the annual elk hunt needed experienced guides, her name was first on the list. But Sarah's skills extended beyond marksmanship. Her father had taught her to read people as carefully as she read animal tracks. She could spot trouble from a mile away, whether it came in the form of an approaching storm or men with bad intentions. This ability to sense danger would prove invaluable on the day that would test everything her father had taught her. The morning of the incident started like any other. Sarah rose before dawn, as was her custom, and prepared for a solo hunting trip in the Gallatin National Forest. She had been tracking a particular elk for weeks, learning its patterns and habits. Today felt like the day she would finally get her shot. She loaded her truck with supplies, secured her great-grandfather's rifle in its case, and set out for the mountains as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. The drive to her chosen hunting spot took nearly 2 hours along winding mountain roads. Sarah enjoyed these solitary journeys, using the time to center herself and prepare mentally for the hunt ahead. She reviewed the terrain in her mind, planned her approach routes, and considered wind direction and weather conditions. Hunting wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was a chess match between predator and prey that required patience, intelligence, and respect for the natural world. As she reached the trailhead, Sarah noticed another vehicle parked nearby. This wasn't unusual, as the area was popular with hunters during the season. However, something about the men she glimpsed in the distance struck her as odd. They moved differently than experienced hunters, with less awareness of their surroundings and more focus on their equipment than on the environment around them. She made a mental note to keep her distance and continued with her preparations. Sarah's hunting outfit was practical and well-worn. She dressed in layers, knowing that mountain weather could change rapidly. Her boots were broken in from years of use, providing silent steps on forest floors covered with fallen leaves and twigs. She carried minimal gear, believing that skill and knowledge mattered more than expensive equipment. Besides her rifle, she brought only water, energy bars, a first-aid kit, and a knife that had belonged to her grandfather. The trail leading into the forest was familiar to Sarah. She had walked it countless times with her father, learning to identify animal signs and understand the rhythms of the wilderness. Today, as she made her way deeper into the woods, she felt the familiar peace that came from being alone in nature. The stress of modern life seemed to melt away with each step, replaced by an ancient alertness that connected her to generations of hunters who had walked similar paths. 2 hours into her hunt, Sarah found fresh elk sign. The tracks were large and deep, indicating a mature bull, and they were recent enough to still show clear definition in the soft earth. She followed the trail carefully, moving with the silent grace her father had taught her. Every sense was heightened as she tracked her quarry through dense timber and across small clearings where wildflowers still bloomed despite the approaching winter. The elk trail led her toward a natural depression in the mountainside, a place where animals often came to drink from a small stream that flowed year-round. Sarah had taken several elk in this area over the years, and she knew the terrain well. She positioned herself downwind from the likely approach routes and settled in to wait. Patience was perhaps the most important skill a hunter could possess, and Sarah had learned this lesson well. As the hours passed, Sarah remained motionless in her hiding spot. She watched the play of sunlight through the tree canopy, listened to the sounds of birds and small animals going about their daily lives, and felt herself becoming part of the natural world around her. This was what she loved most about hunting, not the moment of the kill, but the deep connection to something larger than herself. It was during this peaceful vigil that Sarah first noticed something was wrong. A subtle change in the behavior of the forest animals caught her attention. Birds that had been singing fell silent, and small creatures that had been moving through the underbrush became still. Something was approaching that didn't belong, something that had disturbed the natural order of the wilderness. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She scanned the area carefully, looking for whatever had caused the animals to react. Her grip on the rifle tightened unconsciously as she searched for signs of danger. Years of hunting had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now those instincts were telling her that she was no longer alone in these woods. The first sign of trouble came as voices carried on the wind. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. These weren't the quiet, respectful voices of serious hunters. They were loud, careless, and tinged with something that made her skin crawl. She remained perfectly still, knowing that movement would give away her position to whatever was approaching. As the voices grew closer, Sarah began to make out individual words. What she heard made her blood run cold. The men were talking about her, discussing how they had followed her into the woods and what they planned to do when they found her. Their intentions were clearly not friendly, and Sarah realized that she was no longer the hunter. She had become the prey. The realization that she was in serious danger crystallized everything her father had taught her about survival. Miguel had always told her that the wilderness held many threats, and not all of them walked on four legs. He had prepared her for this moment without either of them knowing it, instilling in her the skills and mindset she would need to protect herself when civilization's rules no longer applied. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to slip away quietly, but the men seemed to know the area well enough to track her. She could stay hidden and hope they would pass by, but their conversation suggested they knew exactly where she was. Or she could prepare to defend herself, using every skill her father had taught her and trusting in the weapon that had protected 3 generations of her family. The choice was made for her when she heard one of the men say her name. They weren't just random predators who had stumbled across a lone woman in the woods. They had specifically targeted her. This knowledge changed everything, transforming her fear into something harder and more focused. Sarah Martinez was not going to be a victim, and anyone who thought otherwise was about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating a rancher's daughter. As the voices grew closer, Sarah prepared for the confrontation she knew was coming. She checked her rifle, ensuring a round was chambered and the safety was off. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate and steadying her hands. Most importantly, she drew upon everything her father had taught her about survival, knowing that the next few minutes would test whether those lessons had been learned well enough to keep her alive. The last peaceful moments of Sarah's hunting trip slipped away like morning mist, replaced by the cold reality of a fight for survival. In the distance, she could hear the men moving through the forest with increasing confidence, certain that they had cornered their prey. They had no idea that the woman they were hunting was about to become the most dangerous predator in these mountains, armed with skills passed down through generations and a determination that ran as deep as her roots in this wild land. The 3 men who emerged from the treeline were exactly what Sarah had expected from their voices. They moved with the swaggering confidence of predators who believed they had found easy prey, their eyes scanning the area where they thought she was hiding. The leader was a tall, heavily built man with scarred hands and cold eyes that spoke of violence as a way of life. His companions were smaller but no less dangerous, moving with the nervous energy of men high on adrenaline and bad intentions. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Her father had warned her about men like these, drifters who preyed on isolated communities, taking what they wanted through force and intimidation. They had probably seen her in town, watched her routine, and followed her into the wilderness where they believed no one would hear her scream or find her body. What they didn't know was that they had chosen the wrong victim in the wrong place. From her concealed position, Sarah studied their equipment and movements. The leader carried an old shotgun, probably stolen, while his companions had handguns tucked into their waistbands. Their clothing was mismatched and dirty, suggesting they had been living rough for some time. Most importantly, they moved like city predators trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain. They were loud, careless, and completely unaware of how exposed they were to someone who knew these mountains. The leader's voice carried clearly through the crisp mountain air as he addressed his companions. "She's here somewhere. I saw her truck at the trailhead, and there's only one good hunting spot in this direction. Spread out and find her." His tone was casual, as if discussing the weather rather than planning an assault on an innocent woman. This casual cruelty confirmed everything Sarah needed to know about what she was facing. Sarah's tactical training kicked in as she assessed the situation. 3 armed men, spread out in a rough line, moving through unfamiliar territory. They had the advantage of numbers, but she had the advantages of position, knowledge of the terrain, and superior marksmanship skills. More importantly, she was fighting for her life, while they were simply expecting to have their fun with what they saw as helpless prey. As the men began to spread out, Sarah made her decision. She would not run, would not hide, and would not allow these predators to terrorize other innocent women. The skills her father had taught her were about more than hunting animals. They were about protecting what mattered and standing up to those who would prey on the innocent. Today, those lessons would be put to their ultimate test. The first man moved to Sarah's left, trying to circle around what he thought was her position. He was young, maybe 25, with nervous movements that suggested this wasn't his usual type of crime. He kept looking back at his companions for reassurance, clearly uncomfortable with the wilderness setting. Sarah watched him stumble over a fallen log, and knew he would be the easiest target when the time came. The second man took the center position, following what appeared to be a game trail that would bring him close to Sarah's actual hiding spot. He was older than the first, with prison tattoos visible on his forearms and the dead eyes of someone who had crossed lines that normal people never approached. He moved more confidently than his companion, but still made enough noise to alert every animal within a half-mile of his presence. The leader remained in the rear, directing his men like pieces on a chessboard. This told Sarah everything she needed to know about his personality. He was a coward who let others take the risks while he enjoyed the rewards. Men like this were dangerous because they were unpredictable, but they were also vulnerable because they depended on intimidation rather than skill. As the men continued their search, their conversation revealed more about their intentions. They discussed what they would do with Sarah once they caught her, their words making her stomach turn with disgust and rage. They talked about her rifle, planning to steal it along with whatever money she might have. Worst of all, they joked about making sure no one would ever find her body in these vast mountains. Sarah's anger crystallized into something cold and focused. These men had made a fundamental error in judgment. They had assumed she was helpless because she was alone and female. They had no idea that they were dealing with someone who had been raised to handle exactly this kind of situation. Her father's training had prepared her for this moment, and she would not waste the gift he had given her. The young man on the left was the first to get close enough to present a clear shot. He was perhaps 50 yards away, moving carelessly through the underbrush, and completely unaware that he was being watched. Sarah tracked him through her rifle scope, noting his poor footwork and obvious inexperience in the wilderness. When the time came to act, he would be her first target. But Sarah knew that simply shooting the men wasn't enough. She needed to neutralize the threat they represented while ensuring her own survival. 3 against 1 was poor odds, even with her advantages, and she needed to be smart about how she engaged them. Her father had taught her that the best fights were the ones you never had to have, but when violence was unavoidable, it needed to be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. The plan that formed in Sarah's mind was simple but effective. She would take out the youngest man first, using his elimination to panic the other 2 and force them into making mistakes. Then, she would use her superior knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver them, picking them off one by one until the threat was eliminated. It wasn't the kind of plan they taught in hunting safety courses, but it was exactly what the situation demanded. As the young man continued his approach, Sarah prepared herself mentally for what was about to happen. She had never shot another human being, but her father had prepared her for this possibility. He had told her that there might come a time when she would have to choose between being a victim and being a survivor, and that when that moment came, she should remember that good people had a right to defend themselves against evil. The weight of her great-grandfather's rifle felt reassuring in her hands. This weapon had seen combat in World War II, defending freedom against those who would destroy it. Today, it would serve a similar purpose, protecting an innocent woman against predators who believed strength gave them the right to prey on others. The rifle seemed to carry the spirits of all the good people who had wielded it before her. Sarah's breathing slowed as she entered the zone of absolute focus that her father had taught her to find. The world narrowed down to the essential elements: target, wind, distance, breathing, trigger control. Everything else faded away as she prepared to defend her life with skills passed down through generations of strong women who had refused to be victims. The young man was now 40 yards away and closing fast. Behind him, his companions were spreading out according to their leader's directions, each step bringing them closer to the moment when their casual cruelty would meet its match. Sarah's finger found the trigger of her rifle, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without firing. In a few more seconds, these predators would learn that they had badly misjudged their intended victim. The leader's voice carried through the trees one more time, giving orders to his men with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance. "Keep looking," he called out. "She's got to be close. And remember, we need to make this look like a hunting accident when we're done with her." His words sealed his fate and that of his companions, confirming that Sarah was fighting not just for her own life, but potentially for the lives of other women these men might target in the future. Sarah's world contracted to the circle of her rifle scope as she tracked the approaching young man. Every lesson her father had taught her about marksmanship and survival came together in this moment. Her breathing was controlled, her stance was solid, and her mind was clear of everything except the need to protect herself and others from the evil that was walking through these peaceful mountains. The young man took another step forward, then another. Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger as she prepared to begin the fight of her life. In a few seconds, the hunters would become the hunted, and 3 predators would learn that they had chosen the wrong woman to terrorize in the wrong place at the wrong time. The mountains were about to witness a demonstration of what happened when predators met someone who refused to be prey. Time seemed to slow as Sarah prepared to fire the first shot of what would become a legendary confrontation. The rifle that had protected her family for 3 generations was about to add another chapter to its history, and the woman who held it was ready to prove that her father's faith in her had been well placed. The moment of truth was finally at hand. The crack of Sarah's rifle echoed through the mountain valley like thunder, shattering the morning silence and sending birds exploding from the trees in all directions. The young man who had been approaching her position dropped instantly, the bullet catching him center mass before he even knew he was in danger. His cry of pain and shock alerted his companions that their easy hunt had suddenly become a deadly game where they were no longer the predators. Sarah didn't pause to admire her marksmanship. Years of training with her father had taught her that the first shot was just the beginning of any real fight. She was already moving before the echo of her rifle faded, using the confusion and panic of her attackers to relocate to a better position. The wounded man was calling for help, his voice high with pain and fear, while his companions shouted questions and demands that revealed their complete lack of experience with real combat. The leader's voice rose above the chaos, trying to regain control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his expectations. "Where is she? Where did that shot come from?" His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the panic of a coward who had expected easy prey and found a dangerous predator instead. Sarah could hear him moving through the underbrush, his heavy footsteps betraying his position as clearly as if he had been shouting his location. Sarah reached her new firing position just as the second man came into view. He was running toward his wounded companion, his handgun drawn but held uncertainly as he scanned the trailing for targets. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, The sudden realization that he was facing someone who knew these mountains far better than he did, and who was willing to fight back with deadly skill. From her new position, Sarah had a clear view of all three men. The young man she had shot was still alive, but clearly out of the fight, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. The second man was exposed in the clearing, trying to help his wounded companion while watching for threats. The leader had taken cover behind a large boulder, but his position was poorly chosen and offered Sarah multiple angles of attack. Sarah's tactical mind processed the situation with cold efficiency. She had reduced the odds from 3 against 1 to effectively 2 against 1, with both remaining enemies in poor positions and clearly rattled by the sudden reversal of their fortunes. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that in a real fight, momentum was everything and that hesitation could be fatal. The second man made his mistake when he tried to drag his wounded companion to safety. The movement exposed him completely, giving Sarah the clear shot she needed. Her second bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his handgun flying into the brush. He hit the ground hard, crying out in pain and terror as he realized that their intended victim was systematically destroying his group. Now it was just Sarah and the leader, and she could hear him trying to work up the courage to make his move. His voice carried clearly through the mountain air as he called out to her, trying to negotiate his way out of a situation that had gone completely wrong. "Look, lady, we don't want any trouble. Let us take our friends and get out of here, and nobody else has to get hurt." Sarah's response was to put a bullet into the boulder inches from his head, sending rock fragments flying and making her position on negotiations perfectly clear. She had seen what these men were capable of, heard their casual discussions of murder and rape, and knew that letting them escape would only doom other innocent women to face the same threat. Her father had taught her that some fights couldn't be avoided and some enemies couldn't be reasoned with. The leader's attempt at negotiation revealed everything Sarah needed to know about his character. He was a coward who had relied on intimidation and superior numbers to prey on the weak. Now, faced with a real opponent who could fight back, he was looking for any way to escape the consequences of his actions. Sarah knew that men like this never stopped hunting until they were stopped permanently. Moving through the forest with the silent grace her father had taught her, Sarah began to close the distance between herself and the leader. She could hear him moving restlessly behind his inadequate cover, probably trying to spot her position for a desperate shot. He was making enough noise to be heard from 100 yards away, his city-bred ignorance of wilderness skills working against him just as Sarah had hoped. The wounded men were no longer a threat. The young man she had shot first was unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. The second man was conscious but in too much pain to do anything except hold his wounded shoulder and moan. Both would survive their wounds if they received medical attention, but they were completely out of the fight that would determine all of their fates. Sarah reached a position that gave her a clear view of the leader's hiding spot. He was crouched behind the boulder, his shotgun ready, but his eyes were scanning the wrong areas as he tried to locate her. Years of hunting had taught Sarah how to read her prey's behavior, and right now this man was displaying all the signs of an animal that knew it was trapped but didn't know where the predator was hiding. The psychological advantage was entirely Sarah's now. She had demonstrated her superior skills and tactical position, reducing a 3-man assault team to one frightened survivor who was completely out of his element. Her father had taught her that most fights were won in the mind before the first shot was fired, and this confrontation was proving that lesson correct. Sarah could have ended the fight with a single shot, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was her father's voice in her memory, reminding her that taking a life was something that changed a person forever. Perhaps it was her own moral compass, struggling with the idea of becoming an executioner even when facing men who deserved no mercy. Or perhaps it was simply the tactical awareness that keeping the leader alive might provide answers about why these men had targeted her specifically. The decision was taken away from her when the leader made his desperate move. He broke cover suddenly, running toward the tree line in a panic-driven attempt to escape. His movement was clumsy and predictable, exactly the kind of mistake Sarah's father had taught her to wait for. She tracked him easily through her rifle scope, leading his movement, and preparing to end the threat he represented once and for all. But As Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger, the leader stumbled over a fallen log and went down hard, his shotgun flying from his hands as he crashed into the undergrowth. He hit his head on a rock as he fell, and Sarah could see him struggling groggily to regain his feet. The fall had effectively taken him out of the fight without requiring another shot from her rifle. Sarah approached the scene carefully, her rifle ready in case any of the three men were playing possum. But it was clear that the fight was over. The leader was semi-conscious and disarmed, while his two companions were in no condition to pose any further threat. Three predators who had come into these mountains expecting to terrorize an innocent woman had been neutralized by their intended victim. Standing over the men who had tried to destroy her, Sarah felt a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite sort out. There was relief that the immediate danger was over, satisfaction that her father's training had proven sufficient to protect her, and a deep anger at the casual evil these men had brought into her peaceful mountains. But there was also a sadness that such violence had been necessary, and a recognition that this experience had changed her forever. The practical side of Sarah's mind was already working on the next steps. She needed to secure the wounded men and get medical help for those who needed it. She needed to contact law enforcement and report what had happened. Most importantly, she needed to ensure that these predators would never again have the opportunity to terrorize innocent women. As she stood in the mountain clearing, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, Sarah realized that she had passed the ultimate test her father had unknowingly prepared her for. She had faced evil men with evil intentions and had not only survived but had protected others who might have been their future victims. The rifle that had protected 3 generations of her family had added another chapter to its legacy, and the woman who carried it had proven worthy of that trust. The mountains around her seemed to approve of what had transpired. The birds were returning to their songs, the small animals were resuming their daily activities, and the natural order that had been disrupted by the presence of predators was being restored. Sarah had fought for more than just her own life. She had fought for the principle that good people had the right to live without fear of those who would prey upon them. The fight was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Sarah would have to deal with law enforcement, medical personnel, and probably journalists who would want to tell her story. But right now, in this moment of victory, she allowed herself to feel the pride that came from knowing she had honored her father's teachings and proven that his faith in her had been justified. The hunter's daughter had faced her greatest test and had emerged victorious. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the mountain valley as the medical evacuation team prepared to transport the wounded men to the hospital in Billings. Sarah watched from a distance as paramedics worked on the 3 attackers, professional in their duty despite knowing what these men had attempted to do. The young man she had shot first was in critical condition, but stable, while the second man would recover fully from his shoulder wound. The leader had regained consciousness, but remained groggy from his fall. Sheriff Tom Morrison, a longtime friend of Sarah's father, finished taking her statement and closed his notebook with a satisfied snap. At 62, Morrison had seen enough violence in his 30-year career to recognize self-defense when he saw it. The evidence at the scene told a clear story of 3 predators who had stalked an innocent woman into the wilderness and learned a hard lesson about choosing their victims more carefully. "Your daddy would be proud," Morrison told Sarah as they watched the medical team work. "These boys picked the wrong woman to mess with. We found their campsite about 5 miles from here, and it looks like they've been watching your routine for weeks. There's evidence linking them to at least 3 other attacks on women in isolated areas across 3 states. You didn't just save yourself today. You probably saved a lot of other innocent women." The validation from Morrison meant everything to Sarah. She had spent the hours since the confrontation wondering if she had done the right thing, questioning whether she could have handled the situation differently. But the evidence Morrison described confirmed what she had sensed during the fight. These were professional predators who had chosen their lifestyle and their victims deliberately. Her father's training had prepared her for exactly this kind of evil. News crews began arriving as word of the story spread through local media. The image of a young woman successfully defending herself against 3 armed attackers in the wilderness was the kind of story that captured public imagination, especially in a state where self-reliance and personal responsibility were deeply valued cultural principles. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as reporters competed for interviews and exclusive details. The story that emerged in the following days painted Sarah as a modern-day Annie Oakley, a skilled markswoman who had used her abilities to protect not only herself, but potentially countless other women from violent predators. The media focused on her unusual background, her championship shooting records, and the family legacy represented by her great-grandfather's rifle. What they couldn't capture in their stories was the deeper truth about what had really happened in those mountains. Sarah's father arrived at the scene just as the last of the wounded men was being loaded into the helicopter. Miguel Martinez took one look at his daughter's face and knew that she was processing something that would change her forever. He had hoped she would never face the kind of situation he had prepared her for, but he was proud beyond words that his training had proven adequate when the test came. "You did what you had to do," Miguel told his daughter as they stood together watching the helicopter disappear over the mountain peaks. "Those men chose their path, and you chose yours. Your great-grandfather carried that rifle in defense of freedom, and today you carried it in defense of innocence. The weapon has served its purpose once again, and the woman who wielded it has honored our family's legacy." The legal proceedings that followed were remarkably straightforward. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and determined that Sarah had acted in clear self-defense against multiple armed attackers who had demonstrated clear intent to commit serious crimes. The wounded men, faced with overwhelming evidence of their criminal activities across multiple states, accepted plea bargains rather than face trial. They would spend the next 15 years in prison, removed from society and unable to prey on other innocent women. But the real impact of what had happened extended far beyond the legal system. Sarah's story became a rallying point for discussions about women's safety, self-defense rights, and the importance of outdoor skills education. Hunting organizations began using her example to promote firearms training for women, while feminist groups praised her for refusing to be a victim. The story transcended political boundaries to become something that almost everyone could support. Sarah found herself invited to speak at hunting conventions, women's safety seminars, and law enforcement training sessions. Her message was always the same: preparation, training, and mental readiness were the keys to survival when faced with those who would do harm to others. She spoke about her father's teachings, the importance of family traditions, and the responsibility that came with possessing the skills to protect oneself and others. The rifle that had played such a crucial role in the confrontation was eventually displayed in the Montana State Historical Museum, alongside the stories of other firearms that had shaped the state's history. Sarah visited it occasionally, remembering not just the violence it had helped her survive, but the generations of good people who had carried it in defense of what they held dear. The weapon had become a symbol of something larger than itself. In the months following the incident, Sarah returned to her normal routine of hunting, ranching, and competing in shooting sports. But she carried with her a new understanding of what her skills really meant and why her father had been so insistent that she master them completely. The knowledge that she had successfully defended herself against professional predators gave her a confidence that went deeper than mere marksmanship ability. The wilderness area where the confrontation had taken place became something of a pilgrimage site for women interested in outdoor skills and self-defense. Sarah occasionally guided groups through the area, pointing out the tactical lessons the terrain offered and sharing the story of what had happened there. She was careful to emphasize that the goal of self-defense training was not to seek out confrontation, but to be prepared when confrontation couldn't be avoided. Sarah's relationship with hunting evolved as well. While she continued to pursue elk and deer in the traditional way, she now understood on a visceral level the difference between hunting animals for food and protecting human life from human predators. The skills were similar, but the moral weight was completely different. Her father's teachings had prepared her for both, but experiencing the difference had changed her perspective forever. The three men who had attacked her eventually disappeared into the prison system, but their story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of preying on those who appeared vulnerable but were actually prepared to fight back. Law enforcement agencies began sharing Sarah's story in their training programs, using it as an example of how proper preparation and training could turn potential victims into survivors. Years later, Sarah would marry a fellow rancher who shared her love of the outdoors and respect for the traditions that had shaped their community. She passed her father's teachings on to her own children, ensuring that another generation would be prepared to face whatever challenges the world might present. The cycle of preparation, training, and readiness continued, just as it had for generations before her. The mountains where Sarah had faced her greatest test remained unchanged, indifferent to the human drama that had played out among their peaks and valleys. Wild animals continued to follow their ancient patterns. Hunters pursued their quarry with respect and skill, and the natural world continued its eternal dance of predator and prey. But for those who knew the story, those peaks would always represent something more. The place where a young woman had refused to be a victim and had proven that good people, properly prepared, could stand against evil and prevail. The legacy of that confrontation lived on not just in the museum display or the news stories, but in the countless women who were inspired by Sarah's example to take responsibility for their own safety and protection. Shooting ranges reported increased enrollment in women's classes. Outdoor education programs expanded their self-defense components, and a new generation of young women grew up understanding that they had the right and the ability to protect themselves from those who would do them harm. Sarah Martinez had entered those mountains as an experienced hunter pursuing elk. She had left them as something more, a symbol of what was possible when preparation met opportunity, when training met crisis, and when good people refused to surrender to those who chose evil. The hunter's daughter had become a legend, and her story would inspire others for generations to come.